London, 1815. The morning room of Thornfield House gleamed with polished mahogany and spring sunshine as 21-year-old Eleanor Winters bent over her embroidery, her slender fingers working the needle with practiced precision. The cheerful yellow walls and delicate floral furnishings stood in stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere that hung like a shroud over the elegant space. Across the room, Lady Agatha Winters fussed over her two daughters, Cecilia and Beatrice, adjusting lace and smoothing silk as they prepared for the Countess of Harlow's ball that evening. When Eleanor gathered her courage to request permission to attend, Lady Agatha turned cold eyes upon her stepdaughter, her lips curling in a smile that held no warmth. With cutting precision, she informed Eleanor that her plain face and unfortunate scar would only embarrass them all, and that society had no place for damaged goods. The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, though she had heard variations of them countless times in the 5 years since her father had died. Lord Edward Winters had been a kind and loving father, but his death had left Eleanor entirely at the mercy of a stepmother who despised her for both her inheritance and the beauty she had inherited from her mother. The late Lady Winters had been celebrated as an incomparable beauty in her day, and Lady Agatha, who had married Lord Winters just 3 years ago, could not forgive Eleanor for being a living reminder of her predecessor. As Lady Agatha continued preparing her own daughters, Eleanor quietly gathered her embroidery and slipped from the room, her honey-brown curls falling forward to shield the left side of her face, where the scar from the fire that had nearly taken her life at 16 years old traced a path from temple to jaw. She made her way through the grand house to the forgotten East Wing, where her chambers had been relocated shortly after her father died. The systematic campaign to erase Eleanor from society had begun subtly. First, Lady Agatha had claimed Eleanor needed time to properly mourn her father. Then came concerns about her health, her scar, her supposed nervous disposition. Invitations were intercepted, potential callers turned away with excuses, and gradually, the world had forgotten Lord Winters had a daughter at all. Eleanor entered her modest bedchamber, with its faded blue wallpaper and view of the untended East Gardens. This was her prison, though one with comfortable furnishings and plenty of books. Lady Agatha permitted her to remain at Thornfield only because the terms of Lord Winters' will made it impossible to displace her entirely without causing a scandal. Instead, she had chosen a more insidious punishment, condemning her stepdaughter to invisibility. As Eleanor gazed out at the overgrown rose garden her mother had once lovingly tended, she wondered if there would ever be an escape from this half-life, this existence on the margins of a world that had been encouraged to forget her. Beyond the faded blue wallpaper of her bedchamber lay Eleanor's true sanctuary, a forgotten library tucked into the furthest corner of the unused east wing of Thornfield House. She made her way through silent corridors where portraits of Winters' ancestors gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to follow her movement, until she reached the heavy oak door, concealed behind a faded tapestry. The library had clearly been her father's private retreat, untouched since his death, and overlooked during Lady Agatha's aggressive renovations of the main house. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall, unwashed windows, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting golden light across towering bookshelves that reached toward the ornately plastered ceiling. The room smelled of leather bindings, old paper, and the subtle hints of the cedar oil Eleanor used to preserve the precious volumes. She moved with reverent familiarity to a worn leather chair positioned perfectly to catch the light, where a stack of books awaited her return. Unlike her stepsisters, who devoured fashion plates and gossip sheets, Eleanor immersed herself in works of philosophy, natural science, and mathematics, subjects that would have scandalized Lady Agatha had she known the extent of her stepdaughter's unconventional education. Her father had encouraged her intellect from an early age, seeing no reason why his daughter should limit herself to accomplishments deemed suitable for young ladies. The soft click of the door latch announced the arrival of Mrs. Blackwood, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Winters family for over 40 years and remained Eleanor's sole ally in the household. The silver-haired woman carried a tea tray, despite her arthritic hands, having climbed the stairs herself rather than sending a younger servant who might report the hidden library to Lady Agatha. As Eleanor helped her set down the tray, Mrs. Blackwood settled into a companion chair and began her customary sharing of household news and society gossip gleaned from tradespeople and visiting servants. "The Duke of Westmoreland has returned from abroad after 5 years on the continent," she confided in hushed tones, stirring her tea with careful precision. "They say he is refusing every match proposed to him, even Lady Harrington's eldest, and she was considered the beauty of the season." Eleanor nodded with polite but detached interest, her mind already drifting back to the treatise on celestial mathematics she had been studying. The comings and goings of aristocrats, even ones as powerful and wealthy as the Duke of Westmoreland, held little relevance to her secluded existence. She could not possibly imagine how this particular piece of gossip might soon intersect with her carefully contained world, or that the man who had rejected every celebrated beauty in London would shortly upend the quiet resignation with which she had accepted her fate. The pale, lavender light of dawn had barely begun to filter through the morning mist when Eleanor slipped from the house, her heart quickening with the familiar thrill of temporary freedom. These solitary rides, stolen in the hushed hours when Lady Agatha and her daughters slept soundly behind their silk bed curtains, represented the only moments when Eleanor truly felt alive. She wore her oldest riding habit, the forest green wool frayed at the cuffs but perfectly serviceable, her honey-brown hair secured in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Nimbus, her father's aging grey gelding, greeted her with a soft nickering as she entered the stables, the elderly groom Thomas pretending not to notice her, as was their long-standing arrangement. Soon she was galloping through the estate woods, the cool spring air rushing past her face, temporarily banishing the suffocation of her confined existence. The mist hung heavy between ancient oaks, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt removed from the constraints of proper society. It was perhaps this dreamlike quality that caused Eleanor to take the corner too quickly, nearly colliding with another rider who emerged suddenly from a crossing path. Both horses reared in alarm, and Eleanor barely maintained her seat as the stranger deftly controlled his magnificent black stallion. The gentleman, for his attire and bearing, marked him unmistakably as such, apologized with genuine concern, his deep voice carrying a hint of an accent that suggested years abroad. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, with features that balanced aristocratic refinement with unexpected warmth, his dark hair slightly too long for current fashion. As they exchanged apologies, fat raindrops began to fall through the canopy above, quickly intensifying into a proper downpour. The gentleman noticed his horse favoring its right foreleg, the result of their near collision, and with practical decisiveness, suggested they seek shelter in a nearby gamekeeper cottage he had passed earlier. The small stone building offered modest but welcome protection, its single room containing little more than a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a cold hearth. The confined space created an unusual intimacy as they listened to rain hammering against the thatched roof. Their conversation began with polite observations about the weather, but quickly deepened when Eleanor mentioned the volume of Wordsworth peeking from her saddlebag. The gentleman expressed surprise at her literary interests, noting that most ladies of his acquaintance discussed only the weather and fashion with tedious predictability. Eleanor replied without thinking that she found both equally unpredictable and rarely worth the attention they received, immediately biting her lip at her own forthrightness. Instead of taking offense, the gentleman laughed with genuine delight, his grey eyes warming as he regarded her with increasing fascination. They spoke of poetry and philosophy until the rain subsided, neither offering their name or position, existing briefly in a moment outside the rigid hierarchies that governed their world. As they parted ways at the edge of the wood, Eleanor could not possibly know she had just spent the morning in conversation with Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Westmoreland, nor that he rode away equally ignorant that the forthright, intelligent woman with the intriguing scar was the very same reclusive daughter of Lord Winters, whose absence from society had begun to pique his curiosity. The glittering chandeliers of Lord and Lady Berkshire's London townhouse cast prismatic light across the assembled aristocracy, their jewels and finery sparkling like stars against the midnight blue silk wallpaper and gilt furnishings. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Westmoreland, stood with practiced composure near a marble column, his tailored black evening attire and austere countenance creating an aura of unapproachable grandeur that failed to deter ambitious mothers. He had returned from 5 years abroad only to find London society unchanged, still a marketplace where titles and fortunes were bartered through advantageous marriages. He mechanically declined a third dance request from the breathless daughter of a viscount, his attention wandering to the elaborate centerpieces adorning the dining table visible through open double doors. His closest friend, Lord James Hastings, approached with 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to Alexander with a knowing smirk. When James inquired about his evident distraction, Alexander reluctantly admitted his thoughts had repeatedly returned to the woman he had encountered in the woods 3 days prior. "There was something about her that challenges me," he confided in low tones, her directness, her intellect untempered by the usual social niceties. "Most women tell me what they believe I wish to hear, but she spoke as though my title were irrelevant." James laughed softly, noting that most women would faint at the mere prospect of spending an unchaperoned hour with the Duke of Westmoreland in a gamekeeper cottage. Alexander was saved from responding by the announcement of new arrivals. Lady Agatha Winters entered with 2 young women who shared her pinched expression and calculating eyes, though they had been dressed in the height of fashion. Lady Agatha immediately began a determined circuit of the room, positioning her daughters advantageously and speaking loudly of their accomplishments in music and watercolors. When she maneuvered toward Alexander, he politely excused himself and approached his host, Lord Berkshire, who was refreshing his glass at the sideboard. With careful casualness, Alexander inquired about the Winters family, mentioning his vague recollection of Lord Edward from years past. Lord Berkshire, pleased to be singled out for conversation by the powerful Duke, readily shared what he knew. Lord Edward had died some 5 years ago, leaving his estate to his only daughter from his first marriage, with provisions for his second wife and her daughters. Lady Agatha now managed Thornfield until the daughter came of age, though most had forgotten the girl existed. "Ah, yes, the stepdaughter," Alexander prompted, maintaining a facade of mild curiosity. Lord Berkshire lowered his voice, explaining she was never seen in society, reportedly due to a nervous disposition and a disfiguring scar from the same fire that ultimately claimed Lord Winter's life some months later. Alexander felt pieces clicking into place as he recalled the slender, honey-haired woman from the woods, the graceful way she had kept her left profile turned from him, the flashing intelligence in her eyes when discussing literature. His interest in the hidden Miss Winters grew exponentially, fueled now by suspicion of her stepmother motives. If the young woman he had met was indeed Eleanor Winters, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep her isolated from society, and Alexander found himself increasingly determined to discover why. 3 days after their woodland encounter, Thornfield House erupted into unprecedented chaos as Lady Agatha burst into the breakfast room, her face flushed with excitement and alarm, announcing that the Duke of Westmoreland himself would be paying a formal call that very afternoon. The news sent the household into a frenzy, with servants polishing silver that had not gleamed in years, fresh flowers being arranged in every room, and the best tea service brought out from storage. Lady Agatha immediately banished Eleanor to her bedroom in the East Wing, with strict instructions not to show herself under any circumstances, hissing that the Duke would hardly wish to encounter a scarred spinster when he was clearly coming to evaluate Cecilia and Beatrice as potential Duchess material. Eleanor retreated obediently, but curiosity drew her to a hidden alcove overlooking the main entrance hall, just as the impressive ducal carriage arrived. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the tall figure descending from the vehicle as her companion from the gamekeeper cottage, his aristocratic bearing now unmistakable in his formal attire. Mortification washed over her like ice water as she realized she had spent hours in unchaperoned conversation with one of the most powerful men in England, speaking to him with a directness that would have scandalized Lady Agatha. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see into the formal drawing room where Lady Agatha fawned over the Duke, presenting her daughters like prized mares at auction. Eleanor crept closer, finding a position near a partially open door where she could hear the conversation within. The Duke accepted tea with cool politeness, his deep voice carrying easily to her hiding place as he skillfully steered the conversation toward the history of Thornfield and its inhabitants. When Lady Agatha mentioned Lord Winters in passing, the Duke commented that he seemed to recall Lord Winters had a daughter from his first marriage. He stated with pointed directness that he was unaware Lord Winters had a daughter besides Lady Agatha's own, his tone making it clear he knew otherwise. Lady Agatha stammered through a series of increasingly transparent excuses, claiming poor Eleanor suffered from delicate health and a nervous disposition that made society overwhelming for her. The scar, she added in hushed tones, made the poor girl so self-conscious that she preferred seclusion. Eleanor burned with indignation at these falsehoods, even as she noted the Duke's skeptical expression. He pressed further, inquiring whether Miss Winters ever received visitors, or if she might join them now, as he had business regarding the estate that rightfully involved her. Lady Agatha fluttered in evident panic, insisting Eleanor was indisposed with a migraine, promising to convey any messages. Throughout the exchange, Eleanor observed the Duke's penetrating gaze and the slight tightening of his jaw that suggested he recognized the deception unfolding before him. As he took his leave with perfect courtesy, his eyes swept the entrance hall as though searching for something or someone, and Eleanor shrank back into the shadows, torn between hope and terror, at the realization that the Duke of Westmoreland was determined to uncover the truth of her situation. After the Duke's carriage disappeared down the long gravel drive, Eleanor exhaled with relief and slipped from her confinement, desperate for fresh air after the emotional turmoil of witnessing Lady Agatha's deceptions. She made her way to the overgrown rose garden on the east side of the property, a once magnificent space her mother had lovingly tended before her death 12 years ago. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through untrimmed branches, casting dappled shadows across the weathered stone paths, as Eleanor knelt to examine a struggling white rose, its petals fighting through years of neglect. So absorbed was she in this task that she failed to notice the tall figure approaching, until a deep voice spoke mere feet behind her. "Miss Winters, I presume," he said, causing Eleanor to rise and turn with a startled gasp. The Duke of Westmoreland stood before her, having evidently circled back to Thornfield on foot after his carriage departed. The golden sunlight fell directly across her face, fully illuminating the scar that traced from her temple down her cheek. But Eleanor made no attempt to hide it from him, as she had instinctively done with others since the fire. She acknowledged her identity, with a dignity that belied her inner turmoil, asking how he had known. His grey eyes, warm with intelligence, studied her face as he explained his suspicions about her enforced seclusion and his determination to meet the daughter of a man he had respected. Their conversation flowed with the same ease it had in the gamekeeper cottage as Eleanor gradually revealed the truth of her situation, how Lady Agatha had systematically erased her from society following her father's death. "She claimed it was to protect me," Eleanor explained, her fingers unconsciously tracing the path of her scar. "But walls can be both shields and prisons, and I have come to understand that my stepmother fears what I represent, rather than fears for my well-being." Alexander listened intently, his expression grave yet somehow tender as he surveyed the neglected garden surrounding them. When he finally spoke, his words carried a depth of understanding that caught Eleanor by surprise. "Some flowers bloom best away from others," he observed, gesturing toward a particularly vibrant rose that had flourished, despite its isolation from the carefully tended beds, growing stronger in solitude than it might have among the cultivated blooms. In that moment, with afternoon light gilding her honey-brown hair and determination shining in her eyes, Alexander saw beyond her plainness to the remarkable spirit within, a woman of intelligence and resilience who had created her own inner garden while the outer world forgot her existence. As she met his gaze without artifice or coquetry, something shifted in the air between them, a connection forming that transcended the conventional foundations upon which aristocratic matches were typically built, something rooted in mutual recognition rather than social advantage. The tranquility of Thornfield was shattered one crisp morning by the arrival of an imposing carriage emblazoned with the Westmoreland ducal crest, its matched black horses and liveried footmen creating an immediate stir among the household staff. Lady Agatha had barely time to arrange her features into a welcoming smile before the formidable Dowager Duchess of Westmoreland swept into the entrance hall, her regal bearing and piercing blue eyes, so like her grandson's, immediately commanding the space. At 76, Sophia Blackwood remained a force that intimidated even the most hardened members of society, her sharp tongue and unassailable position making her both feared and respected throughout London. Lady Agatha fluttered nervously, offering refreshments and making obsequious remarks about the unexpected honor of such a visit, but the Dowager cut through the pleasantries with aristocratic directness, announcing that she had come specifically to invite Miss Eleanor Winters to her literary salon the following week, as the late Lord Winters had been a dear friend. The library was selected for their discussion, and Eleanor was hastily summoned from her morning studies, arriving breathless and wide-eyed to find herself in the presence of a woman whose reputation preceded her. The Dowager Duchess surveyed Eleanor with frank assessment, taking in the scar without comment, and instead engaging her immediately in a discussion of Mary Wollstonecraft's latest work, testing the young woman's knowledge and opinions with rapid questions. As Eleanor responded thoughtfully, the contrast between the women became starkly apparent. The Dowager's genuine intellectual curiosity and Eleanor's eager engagement, highlighting Lady Agatha's shallow pretensions as she attempted to insert herself into a conversation that quickly left her behind. Though Lady Agatha made several transparent attempts to divert the invitation by mentioning Eleanor's supposed frailty and nervous disposition, she found herself unable to refuse such a powerful figure, particularly when the Dowager fixed her with an arctic stare and remarked that fresh air and stimulating conversation were precisely the remedies for such ailments, if indeed they existed at all. As arrangements were finalized for Eleanor to be collected by the Dowager's carriage the following Tuesday, the elderly woman took Eleanor aside for a moment, her gnarled but ring-laden fingers grasping the younger woman's arm with surprising strength. In a voice pitched too low for Lady Agatha to hear, she confided that her grandson spoke of little else but Eleanor's mind-child, finding it most intriguing. The subtle emphasis she placed on the word mind, combined with the knowing twinkle in her eye, sent a flush of color across Eleanor's cheeks as she realized Alexander must have shared details of their encounters with his grandmother. As the Dowager Duchess departed with the same whirlwind efficiency with which she had arrived, Eleanor stood on the steps of Thornfield watching the carriage disappear, a small smile playing at her lips as she recognized that for the first time in 5 years, a door to the outside world had been forced open, and not even Lady Agatha could close it again. The morning of the literary salon dawned clear and bright, as though nature itself approved of Eleanor's first tentative steps back into society after 5 years of seclusion. She stood before the mirror in her bedchamber, critically assessing the modest blue gown Lady Agatha had grudgingly provided, its serviceable style several seasons out of date but clean and well pressed. The Dowager Duchess' carriage arrived precisely at noon, and to Eleanor's surprise, both Cecilia and Beatrice had been instructed to accompany her, Lady Agatha clearly unwilling to relinquish the opportunity for her daughters to be seen at Westmoreland House. The grand London residence loomed imposingly as they arrived, its Portland stone facade and classical proportions declaring generations of wealth and power. Eleanor followed the butler through marbled halls adorned with priceless art until they reached an elegant drawing room where perhaps 20 distinguished guests conversed in small groups. Her heart hammered against her ribs as every head turned to observe their entrance, but a familiar tall figure immediately approached, Alexander Blackwood extending a formal welcome that nevertheless conveyed a warmth directed solely at Eleanor. The Dowager Duchess swept forward to make introductions, presenting Eleanor to an intimidating collection of intellectuals, politicians, and aristocrats with evident pleasure. The initial conversation remained superficial, until a heated debate erupted regarding Rousseau's theories on natural education, at which point Eleanor, forgetting her nervousness, offered a thoughtful critique that silenced the room. She spoke with quiet authority about the inherent contradictions in Rousseau's approach, suggesting alternative interpretations that balanced his idealism with practical application. The distinguished assembly listened with growing interest, several nodding approvingly, as Alexander watched with unmistakable pride. his grandmother leaning close to murmur that intelligence and courage represented a rare combination indeed. Eleanor's confidence grew as the discussion continued, her years of isolated study proving unexpectedly valuable in this gathering of educated minds. From across the room, Cecilia and Beatrice observed with thinly veiled fury, their own superficial accomplishments in watercolors and pianoforte suddenly appearing hollow compared to their stepsister's genuine erudition. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander suggested a turn about the gardens, offering Eleanor his arm with a formality that did nothing to disguise the eagerness in his eyes. Among beds of early summer roses and classical statuary, he confessed that he had initially sought her out because rumors of her reclusiveness had intrigued him, a mystery he felt compelled to solve. "But I stay because your mind captivates me," he admitted, his grey eyes intent upon her face, the scar seemingly invisible to his gaze. In that sunlit moment, with butterflies dancing around lavender borders and the distant murmur of intellectual discourse floating through open windows, Eleanor felt something long dormant within her, unfurling like a flower reaching toward light, the possibility that her life might yet contain more than the quiet resignation she had accepted as her portion. The weeks following the literary salon transformed Eleanor in ways that extended beyond her gradual re-emergence into society. Invitations arrived with increasing frequency, each one grudgingly delivered by Lady Agatha, who watched with mounting rage as her stepdaughter attracted attention she had intended for her own daughters. The culmination came with an invitation to Lord and Lady Pembroke's grand midsummer ball, an event Eleanor had never imagined attending. Lady Agatha initially forbade it, but a pointed note from the Dowager Duchess made refusal impossible. On the evening of the ball, Eleanor descended the stairs in a gown of pale ivory silk, simple but elegant, her honey-brown hair arranged to partially conceal her scar without completely hiding it, a new confidence evident in her bearing. Lady Agatha observed her with calculating eyes, her tight smile concealing the plot she had carefully orchestrated. The Pembroke ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers, hundreds of candles illuminating the elaborate floral displays and elegant couples who moved across the polished floor in precise formations. Eleanor stood near a marble column, overwhelmed by the sensory experience after so many years of seclusion, until Alexander appeared at her side, his tall figure commanding immediate attention as he led her onto the dance floor with evident pride. They had completed just one set when Lady Agatha implemented her scheme, instructing a nervous young footman to stumble near Eleanor, spilling red wine across the front of her ivory gown. As Eleanor gasped in dismay, Lady Agatha rushed forward with false concern, loudly lamenting the accident while steering her stepdaughter toward a group of notorious gossips. With precisely calibrated volume, Lady Agatha expressed theatrical worry about Eleanor's distress, suggesting that the poor child takes after her mother's family, brilliance touched by madness, you understand. She continued with exaggerated sympathy, detailing supposed incidents of unstable temperament, nervous attacks, and inappropriate behavior, each word carrying clearly to nearby listeners who leaned closer with avid curiosity. The whispers spread through the ballroom like fire through dry grass, reaching Eleanor in fragments as she attempted to dab at her ruined gown. Heads turned in her direction, expressions shifting from curiosity to pity to faint alarm, the atmosphere around her cooling noticeably as the cruel gossip circulated. Even her recent intellectual triumph at the salon was recast as evidence of an unnatural, possibly hereditary intensity that might manifest in concerning ways. The contrast between the glittering elegance surrounding her and the growing awareness of her own social destruction overwhelmed Eleanor, tears threatening despite her determination to maintain dignity. She slipped away from concerned onlookers, finding refuge on a darkened terrace where the cool night air offered little comfort against the burning humiliation. Lady Agatha had achieved her aim with surgical precision, ensuring that Eleanor's brief emergence into society ended with such mortification that she would surely retreat permanently, leaving the Duke of Westmoreland to seek a more suitable match among untainted options, preferably Cecilia or Beatrice Winters. Eleanor had scarcely been on the terrace for 5 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching, the familiar cadence immediately identifying Alexander before he stepped into the pool of moonlight where she stood. He came to her side without hesitation, offering a handkerchief for her tears, which silvered her cheeks in the gentle illumination. "Society's opinions shift like sand," he told her softly, easily carried away by the next breeze of gossip, while true worth remains constant as the stars above us. His gentle words opened a dam within her, allowing her grief to pour forth as she confessed her humiliation and certainty that her brief emergence into society had been permanently destroyed by Lady Agatha's cruelty. Alexander surprised her by taking her hands in his, revealing that he knew the truth of her circumstances, having investigated her past thoroughly since their first meeting in the woods. Her mother's family had no history of madness or instability. They were scholars and artists whose intellectual pursuits Lady Agatha had recast as something sinister. More shocking still, he knew the true origin of her scar, not from some mysterious accident as society had been led to believe, but from her brave attempt to save her father during the fire that ultimately claimed his life months later from lung damage caused by smoke. "Your stepmother feared your inheritance and your beauty before the accident," Alexander explained, his grey eyes reflecting moonlight as distant music from the ballroom floated through the night air. "Now she fears your mind and the power it gives you to claim what is rightfully yours." The intimate terrace setting, secluded from prying eyes yet within reach of civilized society, created a sanctuary in which truth could finally emerge without artifice or pretense. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as Alexander continued, his deep voice carrying a conviction that warmed her more than any shawl could have against the cool night air. He had been introduced to every celebrated beauty in England, paraded before him since his return from abroad, yet found no one who moved him as she did, with her quiet intelligence, her resilience, and her capacity to see beyond titles to the person beneath. "I admire your mind," he continued, "but I have come to cherish your heart even more." The honesty in his declaration, free from flattery or strategic advantage, kindled something within Eleanor that Lady Agatha's schemes had failed to extinguish completely, a courage born of being truly seen and valued for precisely who she was. Without speaking, she placed her hand on his offered arm, standing straighter as they moved toward the ballroom doors. Together they re-entered the glittering space, Eleanor no longer attempting to hide her scar or her connection to the Duke, whose protective stance and proud expression silenced the whispers more effectively than any denial could have done. In that moment, with every eye upon them, Eleanor Winters took her first step toward refusing to be hidden any longer, her quiet dignity, a more powerful rebuke to Lady Agatha's machinations than any words could have achieved. 3 days after the Pembroke ball, Eleanor received a formal summons to Westmoreland House, the messenger indicating that the Duke wished to discuss a matter of great importance regarding her inheritance. She arrived to find herself escorted not to the drawing room but to Alexander's private study, an imposing space lined with dark oak paneling and filled with maps, books, and artifacts from his extensive travels. The seriousness of the atmosphere was immediately apparent, with Alexander standing beside a distinguished older gentleman he introduced as Mr. Harrington, his family solicitor. The grave expressions on both men's faces caused Eleanor immediate concern, but nothing could have prepared her for the revelation that followed. Mr. Harrington explained that while organizing old correspondence belonging to the Dowager Duchess, he had discovered a letter from Lord Winters containing references to a will that differed substantially from the document Lady Agatha had presented after his death. Further investigation had unearthed the true will, properly witnessed and sealed, hidden among Lord Winters' business papers that had been transferred to the Dowager Duchess for safekeeping shortly before his death. The solicitor unfolded the document with careful hands, explaining in measured tones that according to these legal instructions, Eleanor had inherited not merely a portion but the vast majority of the Winters estate, including Thornfield House itself, with Lady Agatha granted only a modest allowance and the use of a dower house on the property. For 5 years, her stepmother had been systematically mismanaging an estate that rightfully belonged to Eleanor, siphoning funds for her own use, while keeping the true heir isolated and ignorant of her rights. "She had every reason to keep you hidden," Alexander said softly. "Your emergence into society threatened her control, creating the risk that someone might recognize the disparity between your circumstances and your rightful position. The gravity of the betrayal settled over Eleanor like a physical weight as she struggled to absorb the implications. Lady Agatha's cruelty suddenly made perfect sense, not merely the petty jealousy Eleanor had assumed, but a calculated campaign to protect her fraudulent claim to the Winters' fortune. Faced with the opportunity for justified retribution, Eleanor found herself torn between righteous anger and a reluctance to inflict the same suffering she had endured. "What kind of person would I become if I repaid cruelty with cruelty?" she asked quietly, her grey eyes meeting Alexander's across the polished surface of his desk. "Lady Agatha has 2 daughters to consider, whatever her sins against me." The soft light from the study windows illuminated her face as she spoke, revealing not weakness but a moral fortitude that clearly moved Alexander. He watched her with evident admiration as she began to consider a path forward that would restore her rights without descending to her stepmother's level of vindictiveness, her inherent compassion remaining intact despite years of mistreatment. The morning after her revelatory meeting at Westmoreland House, Eleanor returned to Thornfield with purpose in her stride, requesting Lady Agatha join her in the formal drawing room after breakfast. The space, with its faded elegance and portraits of Winter's ancestors gazing down from gilt frames, provided the perfect setting for the reckoning that had been 5 years in coming. Eleanor positioned herself near the fireplace, drawing strength from the faces of generations past, particularly her mother's gentle visage captured in oils above the mantel. When Lady Agatha swept in with her usual air of authority, she faltered momentarily at the sight of Eleanor, standing tall in the place traditionally occupied by the mistress of the house. Without preamble, Eleanor informed her stepmother that she was aware of the true will and the systematic deception that had relegated her to the shadows while her inheritance was misappropriated. Lady Agatha's face drained of colour as Eleanor continued in measured tones, explaining that the legal documents had been recovered and authenticated, returning control of Thornfield and the entire Winters estate to its rightful heir. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing between the 2 women as Eleanor delivered her decision. "You will continue to live here, and your daughters will have their dowries as my father wished," she stated calmly. "But this house and its management return to me, effective immediately." Rather than responding with denial or rage as Eleanor had expected, Lady Agatha seemed to crumple before her eyes, sinking onto a nearby settee as years of carefully maintained pretense fell away. With bitter honesty that surprised them both, she confessed the jealousy that had fueled her cruelty. "Your mother had everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Beauty, love, respect, while I was always overlooked, always second choice, always the practical option rather than the beloved one." She had married Lord Winters, hoping to finally claim the position and admiration she craved, only to find herself forever in the shadow of his first wife, whose daughter served as a constant reminder of what Lady Agatha could never be. The pain evident in both women filled the space between them, their shared understanding of what it meant to be overlooked, creating an unexpected moment of connection. "And so you taught me how that feels," Eleanor responded softly, the simple truth of her words carrying more impact than any accusation could have done. In that moment, illuminated by the same afternoon sunlight that highlighted the silver strands in Lady Agatha's carefully arranged hair and the scar on Eleanor's youthful face, they recognized in each other the damage that had been both received and inflicted, creating a fragile bridge of understanding that, while not erasing the past, offered the possibility of a less bitter future. The newfound clarity regarding her position emboldened Eleanor to accept an invitation to Lady Hartley's dinner party, an event she would have once considered beyond her reach. The Hartley townhouse gleamed with ostentatious wealth, its dining room, a temple to excess with gilt chairs, enormous floral arrangements, and place settings of the finest china and silver. Eleanor entered with quiet dignity on Alexander's arm, the Dowager Duchess following behind with regal authority, but even this formidable alliance could not prevent the wave of whispers that rippled through the assembled guests. Though Eleanor had reclaimed her rightful place at Thornfield and taken steps to correct years of financial mismanagement, society remained skeptical of her rapid rise from seclusion, to the evident favourite of England's most eligible duke. Lady Hartley, a woman whose social influence was matched only by her capacity for cruelty, made little attempt to disguise her disapproval, seating Eleanor far from Alexander, and between two nearly deaf gentlemen who showed no interest in conversation. The sumptuous courses arrived in elegant procession, each more elaborate than the last, while Eleanor maintained her composure despite the whispers that reached her ears in fragments, comments about her scar, her years of isolation, and her supposed unsuitability for a man of Alexander's position. As the final course was served, Lady Hartley raised her voice to ensure it carried down the table, remarking to her companion that a recluse with a scarred face and a questionable background hardly seemed suitable for England's most eligible duke, regardless of her newly discovered fortune. The table fell silent at this breach of even the most minimal standards of courtesy, all eyes turning to Alexander, whose expression had hardened to granite. He set down his glass with deliberate care, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed dining room, as he announced that he found himself fortunate that Miss Winters considered him worthy of her attention, given her superior intelligence and character, qualities that some might overlook in their misguided pursuit of more superficial attributes. Before Lady Hartley could respond, the Dowager Duchess added her own observation that quality recognizes quality, Lady Hartley, even when fashion fails to, a pronouncement delivered with such aristocratic finality that no further comment seemed possible. The remainder of the evening passed in strained politeness, but Eleanor felt a curious lightness despite the confrontation, recognizing that Alexander's public declaration represented a significant step beyond private admiration into open acknowledgement of his intentions. As they departed, Alexander offered his arm with a smile that conveyed both pride and protective fury, while the Dowager Duchess remarked loudly that she found the company somewhat lacking in discernment, but was pleased to see her grandson displaying such excellent judgment in his choice of companions, a statement that would circulate through London drawing rooms by morning, carrying the unmistakable weight of ducal approval. In the weeks following the confrontation at Lady Hartley's, Eleanor devoted herself to restoring her mother's rose garden, the tangible reclamation of her inheritance, bringing a peace that social acceptance never could. The neglected space gradually transformed under her patient care, thorns and weeds giving way to careful order and burgeoning beauty. On a crystalline June morning, with dawn light turning the world to gold, Eleanor knelt among the awakening blooms, her fingers gently freeing a struggling white rose from encroaching vines. She was so absorbed in her task that she did not hear Alexander approaching until his shadow fell across the dewy grass beside her. The garden sparkled around them, thousands of water droplets capturing and reflecting the sunlight, transforming ordinary roses into jeweled wonders. Alexander gazed at her work with evident admiration, noting how the once abandoned space now teemed with life and color, a testament to patient cultivation and unwavering care. These roses were cultivated in isolation, he observed, his voice gentle in the morning stillness, growing stronger away from others, just as you have. The parallel was not lost on Eleanor, whose years of seclusion had forged a depth of character that might never have developed in the shallow waters of society. To her astonishment, Alexander lowered himself to one knee before her, heedless of the damp soil staining his immaculate trousers, taking her earth-stained hands in his. "I do not want a duchess who merely reflects society's shallow values," he said, his grey eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty, "but one who will help me transform them, who brings her own light, rather than merely reflecting that of others." Eleanor felt hope and fear warring within her breast, the possibility of happiness almost too fragile to grasp. "They will always see my scar first," she whispered, her fingers unconsciously rising to trace the mark that had defined her existence for so long. Her words hung in the morning air, the physical manifestation of deeper wounds inflicted by years of enforced invisibility and calculated cruelty. Alexander reached up to gently draw her hand away from her face, holding it firmly in his own. "I see your courage first," he replied with quiet conviction, "your mind second, and everything else as merely the vessel for an extraordinary soul." His words wrapped around her like a protective embrace, offering not pity but profound recognition of her true self. In this garden her mother had planted, surrounded by roses that had survived years of neglect to bloom again with unexpected vigor, Eleanor made her choice. She would step fully into the light, claiming not just her inheritance but the love offered so freely before her. Extending her hands to help Alexander rise, she gave him her answer, accepting the future they would build together, one that would challenge society rather than conform to its limitations. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the dew but leaving the roses no less magnificent for the loss of their temporary adornment, much as Eleanor had emerged from her years of isolation, not diminished but strengthened, ready at last to be fully seen. The autumn day chosen for the wedding dawned with golden light that seemed to bless Thornfield House, now reclaimed and transformed under Eleanor's careful stewardship. The great hall and adjoining rooms had been adorned with roses from her mother's garden, their rich fragrance mingling with beeswax candles and fresh greenery to create an atmosphere of renewed life. As Eleanor walked down the aisle of the small family chapel on the arm of Mr. Rotu Harrington, who had graciously agreed to give her away, sunlight streamed through ancient stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across her ivory gown and illuminating her face. She had chosen not to conceal her scar with powder or strategic hairstyling, the mark now merely a part of her story rather than its defining feature. Near the front, Lady Agatha sat with subdued dignity beside her daughters, their relationship with Eleanor now one of cautious respect, if not genuine warmth, while the Dowager Duchess observed the proceedings with unmistakable approval from her place of honor. Alexander waited at the altar, his tall figure commanding yet welcoming, as his eyes found hers with a warmth that made the assembled guests fade to insignificance. Their vows, spoken in clear voices that carried to the rafters of the ancient chapel, contained promises not only of love and fidelity, but of partnership in creating a world where worth was measured by character rather than conformity. The celebrations that followed blended tradition with the unconventional spirit that characterized their union, setting the tone for the life they would build together. 5 years later, on a bright spring afternoon, Thornfield House hummed with intellectual energy as Eleanor and Alexander hosted their seasonal literary salon, now considered the most stimulating gathering in England. Their expansive drawing room, redesigned to accommodate shelves of books alongside elegant furnishings, welcomed distinguished minds from across Europe for discussions that ranged from natural philosophy to political theory. Among the assembled intellectuals moved their 3-year-old daughter Sophia, a precocious child with her mother's honey-brown curls and her father's confident bearing, carrying a picture book about astronomy as she listened to conversations far beyond her years. Eleanor, now a published philosopher whose treatise on education and woman's intellectual capacity had caused both scandal and admiration in equal measure, moved easily from group to group, her scar no longer drawing curious glances, but instead serving as a mark of recognition, the visible emblem of a woman whose ideas challenged convention. The afternoon sunlight caught the sapphires at her throat, a wedding gift from Alexander, who had commissioned jewels the color of the morning sky they had first shared in the gamekeeper cottage. From her favorite armchair, the Dowager Duchess, now well past 80 but still formidable, observed the scene with evident satisfaction. When a visiting French philosopher remarked on the unusual match her grandson had made, she replied with characteristic directness that Alexander had sought a unique woman and found instead a revolutionary, her sharp eyes twinkling as she watched Eleanor deftly guiding the conversation toward new intellectual territory. What had begun with a chance meeting in misty woods had culminated not merely in personal happiness, but in the gradual transformation of their social circle, creating ripples that extended far beyond Thornfield. Eleanor Winters Blackwood, once hidden away and forgotten, had emerged not just into visibility but into influence, her journey from shadows to light, illuminating a path for others to follow.